Martha Jenkins pushed her cleaning cart through the grand marble hallway of the Whitmore mansion, her worn shoes squeaking softly against the polished floor as morning sunlight streamed through towering windows, casting long shadows that danced across priceless paintings and golden frames that probably cost more than she'd make in 10 years. Yet her eyes weren't drawn to the wealth surrounding her, but to the small figure sitting motionless by the library window, 7-year-old Oliver Whitmore, who hadn't spoken a single word in the 3 months she'd been working here. His pale face pressed against the cool glass as he traced invisible patterns with his delicate fingers, creating designs only he could understand, while the rest of the world buzzed around him in a chaos he seemed determined to ignore. And Martha felt that familiar tug in her chest, the same feeling she'd had when her own grandson struggled to find his place in a world that moved fast and spoke too loud. So she continued, dusting the endless shelves filled with leather-bound books that nobody ever read, watching from the corner of her eye as Oliver's father, Richard Whitmore, led yet another expensive specialist through the door, this one wearing a crisp white coat and carrying a briefcase that clicked open with authority, revealing tests and charts and diagnostic tools that would once again fail to reach the boy who sat like a statue, breathing fog onto the window and drawing circles within circles. And Martha heard the specialist's voice, clinical and detached, saying words like severe and non-responsive and institutional care might be necessary, words that made her hands clench around her dusting cloth because she'd seen the way Oliver's shoulders tensed whenever strangers entered his space, how his fingers moved faster against the glass when voices grew louder, and she knew with certainty that this boy understood everything, trapped inside a mind that worked differently than others expected. And after the specialist left with promises to email treatment plans and medication options, Mr. Whitmore stood in his son's doorway for exactly 30 seconds before his phone rang and pulled him back to his office where million-dollar deals waited and where he could control outcomes with signatures and handshakes, leaving Oliver alone again in his silent world. But Martha noticed something that made her heart skip as she leaned closer to the window, seeing that the fog patterns weren't random at all, but formed letters backwards in the reflection, spelling out a single word that made her gasp quietly. Lonely. And she stood frozen, her mind racing as she realized this child had been communicating all along, but nobody had been watching closely enough to see it. And during her lunch break, instead of eating her sandwich in the kitchen with the other staff, she found herself drawn back to the library, where Oliver still sat. And without really planning it, she pulled out the children's book she'd brought for her grandson's visit next week, settling into a chair just close enough that Oliver might hear but not so close that she'd invade his carefully guarded space. And she began reading aloud in her warm, steady voice about a little rabbit who was afraid of the dark but found courage in the stars. And though Oliver didn't turn around, she saw his reflection in the window and noticed his fingers had stopped moving, his whole body still, but not with the tension of before, rather with the stillness of deep listening, like a deer hearing a familiar sound in the forest. And Martha kept reading, page after page, until her break ended and she had to return to work. But the next day she did the same thing, and the day after that, and by the 4th day, something magical happened as Oliver's chair had moved, just slightly, maybe 3 inches closer to where she sat. Such a small change that anyone else might have missed it. But Martha saw it as the victory it was, and she continued reading every day, sometimes fairy tales, sometimes adventure stories, watching as Oliver's chair crept closer, inch by inch, until by the 2nd week he was sitting just an arm's length away, still facing the window, but clearly listening to every word. And Martha began to notice other changes too, like how Oliver would tap his finger once when he wanted her to read slower, twice when he was ready for the next page, creating their own secret language that belonged only to them. And she started leaving small picture books on the windowsill where he could reach them, never mentioning them aloud but watching with joy as Oliver would pick them up after she left, his fingers tracing the words with intense concentration. And one afternoon, when she accidentally skipped a page in a story they'd read before, Oliver pushed a red block toward her without looking. And when she went back and found the missed page, he pulled the block back, and Martha realized with stunning clarity that this boy wasn't just listening, but was actually learning to read through their quiet sessions, absorbing every word like a sponge soaking up water. And she felt both thrilled and terrified, because she knew Mr. Whitmore had strictly forbidden the staff from attempting any education with Oliver, believing that only medical professionals should handle his son's condition. But how could she stop now when she'd seen the hunger in Oliver's eyes reflected in that window, the desperate need to connect with the world through words and stories? And so she made a decision that could cost her the job she desperately needed but might give Oliver something even more precious: the gift of language and the power to finally express the thoughts she was certain were swirling like hurricanes inside his silent mind. And as she watched him arrange his blocks into patterns that looked suspiciously like letters, Martha knew that tomorrow she would take an even bigger risk and bring alphabet cards hidden in her apron pocket, because some children just needed someone to believe in them enough to break the rules. Martha arrived at the Whitmore mansion 30 minutes earlier than usual, her heart pounding as she clutched the small bag of alphabet cards hidden beneath her cleaning supplies, knowing that what she was about to do could destroy everything, but unable to ignore the memory of Oliver arranging his blocks to spell lonely. And as she quietly entered the library, where Oliver always waited by his window, she found him already there, with something that made her freeze in her tracks. For he had arranged all his toys and blocks across the floor to form perfect letters, spelling "Martha here, please," and she had to cover her mouth to stop the sob that threatened to escape, because this brilliant child had been waiting for someone to see him, truly see him, all along. So she knelt beside him and slowly pulled out the alphabet cards, laying them between them like a bridge connecting two worlds. And Oliver's hand trembled as he reached for the letter H, then I, and placed them together, looking at her reflection in the window as if asking permission to continue. And when Martha nodded with tears streaming down her face, Oliver spelled out "Hi, Martha," and then something extraordinary happened as his lips moved silently, trying to form the sounds he could write but couldn't speak. And Martha spent the next 20 minutes showing him how each letter made its own special sound, using hand gestures and gentle demonstrations, touching her throat so he could see how it vibrated with certain letters. And Oliver watched with such intense concentration that she could almost see the connections forming in his mind like fireworks exploding in slow motion. And when the other staff began arriving, Martha quickly hid the cards and started her regular cleaning routine. But she left a few cards tucked behind books where only Oliver would find them. And throughout the day, whenever she passed the library, she saw him discovering these hidden treasures and arranging them into words like "thank you" and "more please," and even "Martha kind." Each message left where she would find them during her cleaning rounds, creating a secret conversation that flowed between them like an underground river. And as days turned into weeks, their morning sessions became more elaborate, with Martha bringing simple children's workbooks that she'd bought with her own money, teaching Oliver not just letters, but how they danced together to create meaning. And the boy absorbed everything, with a hunger that both amazed and worried her, because he was progressing so fast that it was becoming harder to hide, especially when Oliver started reading labels on cleaning products, and once corrected a spelling error in a note the cook had left from Mr. Whitmore, quickly rearranging the letters when no one was looking. And Martha knew they were playing a dangerous game, but she couldn't stop. Not when Oliver had started leaving her notes that revealed the depth of his understanding. Messages like "I hear everything and Daddy sad too," and once, heartbreakingly, "Why am I broken?" which made Martha hold him for the first time, feeling his thin shoulders shake, with silent tears as she whispered that he wasn't broken, just different, and different was beautiful. And Oliver had pulled away and written "You see me" with shaking hands, and from that day forward, their bond deepened beyond teacher and student to something more like grandmother and grandson. And Martha began teaching him not just reading but writing too, showing him how to hold a pencil properly and form letters that looked like real handwriting instead of block prints. And Oliver practiced constantly, filling notebook after notebook that Martha would smuggle out in her cleaning supplies and hide in her locker, and she started bringing him books from the public library, careful to choose ones that wouldn't be missed from the mansion's grand collection. And Oliver devoured them all, from picture books to beginning chapter books, his reading level advancing so rapidly that Martha had to research teaching methods on her phone during breaks, learning about phonics and sight words and reading comprehension, becoming the teacher she never trained to be but somehow knew how to become. And Oliver began writing stories of his own, simple at first about a boy who could fly or a dog who solved mysteries, but gradually more complex and revealing, stories about a prince locked in a tower who could only communicate through written messages thrown from windows. And Martha treasured every word, knowing she was witnessing something magical and secret and potentially life-changing. But the fear never left her, because Mr. Whitmore had become more distant and frustrated, bringing in new specialists who suggested residential facilities and experimental treatments, never noticing that his son had begun reading his business newspapers left on the breakfast table, or that Oliver had started writing labels for everything in his room, in perfectly formed letters. And Martha watched Oliver struggle with wanting to show his father what he could do while being terrified of disappointing him again. So she encouraged him gently, saying that when the time was right, his father would understand. But she could see the doubt in Oliver's eyes reflected in that window he still loved to sit by. And one day Oliver wrote her a note that said, "Teach me to say Daddy," and Martha's heart shattered, because she realized he wanted so desperately to speak the words he could write, to break through the invisible wall that separated him from his father's love. And she began working on speech exercises she'd found online, simple mouth movements and breathing techniques. And though Oliver couldn't make the sounds come out, she could see him practicing in the window's reflection, his mouth forming silent words over and over again. And Martha knew they were running out of time because Oliver's progress was becoming impossible to hide, as he'd started reading adult novels from the mansion's library and writing complex sentences about his feelings and observations. And she feared what would happen when Mr. Whitmore discovered their secret lessons, but she feared even more what would happen to Oliver if they stopped, because she'd given him something precious and irreplaceable, the power to express himself and connect with the world through words. And as she watched him write, "I want to tell Daddy I love him," one morning, she knew that their secret was about to become impossible to keep. The evening started like any other with Martha and Oliver in their usual spot in the library, the magnetic letterboard between them, as Oliver carefully arranged the words that had been burning inside him for weeks. "I want to tell Daddy I love him," his small fingers trembling with the weight of emotions he'd never been able to express before. And Martha watched with pride and worry, as Oliver had become bolder in recent days, no longer hiding his abilities as carefully as before, reading his father's business documents left on the coffee table, and even organizing them by date, which the secretary assumed Mr. Whitmore had done himself. And Oliver had started writing notes everywhere, like breadcrumbs, hoping his father would follow the trail to discover his son's voice. But Mr. Whitmore was too buried in his work to notice that the grocery list on the refrigerator now included items in Oliver's handwriting, or that his daily newspaper had notes in the margins, commenting on articles about education reform. And Martha felt the danger growing with each passing day, as Oliver grew frustrated with hiding, his notes becoming more urgent with messages like "See me Daddy" left on his father's desk, and "I can learn" written in steam on the bathroom mirror. But that particular evening, fate intervened in a way nobody expected when Mr. Whitmore's important business dinner was canceled at the last minute due to his client's flight being delayed. And instead of calling ahead, he decided to come home directly, wanting to surprise Oliver with the rare gift of his presence. Perhaps take him to the garden, or sit with him, even if they couldn't communicate. His guilt about considering residential carried at him like acid, and as his expensive car pulled into the driveway, 3 hours earlier than usual, Martha was helping Oliver spell out a new sentence. Martha taught me to fly with words. Both of them so absorbed in the lesson that they didn't hear the front door open or the footsteps approaching down the marble hallway, and Oliver was just reaching for another letter when the library door swung open, and time seemed to stop. As Mr. Whitmore stood frozen in the doorway, his eyes taking in the scene of his supposedly unreachable son arranging magnetic letters while the maid he'd specifically instructed not to interfere sat beside him with worksheets and books spread across the floor, and Martha felt her blood turn to ice as she saw the emotions flash across her employer's face like a slideshow of shock, confusion, betrayal, and finally anger. His voice coming out sharp and cold as he said, "You're fired, Miss Jenkins. Collect your things and leave immediately." And Martha started to stand, her legs shaking as she began gathering the teaching materials. But Oliver did something that nobody expected, suddenly jumping to his feet with more purpose than anyone had ever seen from him, walking directly to his father, with determined steps, his hand clutching a piece of paper he'd been hiding beneath the magnetic board, and he held it out to his father with eyes that blazed with desperate hope, and Mr. Whitmore almost didn't take it, his anger still hot and fresh. But something in Oliver's face made him reach for the paper, and as he unfolded it, his hands began to shake, because there, in his son's careful handwriting, were the words Martha taught me to read. "Now I can tell you, I love you, Daddy. I always could hear you. I just couldn't find my words before." And the silence that followed was so complete that they could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway. And Mr. Whitmore read the note again and again, his face crumbling as 7 years of pain and frustration and failure crashed over him like a wave. And Oliver reached into his pocket, pulling out more papers. Dozens of them, all the notes he'd been writing for weeks but had been too scared to share. And they fluttered to the floor like snow as Mr. Whitmore's legs gave out and he sank into the nearest chair, reading messages like, "I know you're tired, Daddy. I'm not broken, just different. Martha sees me. I want to make you proud. The doctors scare me. Please don't send me away." And with each note his sobs grew louder until this powerful billionaire was crying like a child, while Oliver stood perfectly still, watching his father with eyes that held too much wisdom for a 7-year-old, and Martha remained frozen by the door, unsure whether to leave or stay, her heart breaking for both father and son. And finally, Mr. Whitmore looked up at her with red eyes and asked, in a broken voice, "How long has he been able to do this?" And Martha quietly replied, 3 months, sir. He learned so fast. He's brilliant, Mr. Whitmore. Truly brilliant." And Oliver walked to the magnetic board and spelled out, "Martha is my teacher and my friend." And Mr. Whitmore watched his son create words with the same intensity he usually reserved for million-dollar contracts, finally seeing what had been in front of him all along, a child who didn't need to be fixed but needed to be understood. And Oliver began arranging more words, faster now, his confidence growing as he spelled out, "I read Shakespeare, I understand math, I write stories, I dream in colors." Each revelation hitting Mr. Whitmore like a physical blow as he realized how much of his son's life he'd missed, how many assumptions he'd made, how many specialists he'd trusted over his own instincts. And Oliver created one more message that made everyone in the room hold their breath. "Can Martha stay, please?" And he turned to look at his father with eyes that held all the hope and fear of a child who'd been disappointed too many times before. And Mr. Whitmore stood up slowly, walked to his son, and for the first time in years, really looked at him, not as a problem to be solved or a condition to be treated, but as Oliver, his son, brilliant and complex and perfect in his imperfection. And he whispered, "Ms. Jenkins, please don't go. We need to talk. All 3 of us need to talk." And as Martha stepped forward, Oliver did something that shocked everyone, including himself. His mouth opened, and though no sound came out, his lips clearly formed the word daddy. And even though it was silent, it was the loudest thing anyone in that room had ever heard. Mr. Whitmore's hands wouldn't stop shaking as he held the pile of Oliver's notes, reading each one like a sacred text, while Martha quietly explained everything that had happened over the past 3 months. Her voice soft but steady as she told him about the backward writing in the window, the secret morning lessons, the hidden alphabet cards, the way Oliver had memorized entire books after reading them just once. And with every word she spoke, Mr. Whitmore's face grew paler as the magnitude of his blindness hit him like physical blows. Realizing he'd spent 7 years and millions of dollars on specialists who talked about Oliver as if he were a problem to be solved, rather than a child to be loved. And Oliver sat between them now, his small body tense as he watched his father's face for any sign of anger or disappointment. But all he saw were tears streaming down the face of a man who'd built $1 billion empire, but couldn't see the treasure living in his own home. And Martha pulled out her phone, showing Mr. Whitmore videos she'd secretly recorded of Oliver's progress. Footage of him reading complex sentences, writing poetry about the sunrise, solving math problems she'd found in textbooks, and in one particularly heartbreaking video, Oliver had written, "I wish Daddy knew. I understand when he says he loves me." And Mr. Whitmore had to pause the video because he couldn't see through his tears, remembering all the nights he'd stood in Oliver's doorway and whispered those words, thinking his son couldn't hear or understand, never knowing that Oliver had been collecting those words like precious gems, storing them in his heart for the day he could finally respond. And Martha continued revealing Oliver's hidden brilliance, explaining how he'd been teaching himself multiple subjects by reading the mansion's vast library, how he'd memorized entire encyclopedias, how he'd been writing a book about a father and son who found each other through a magical library where words came alive. And she pulled out a notebook she'd been hiding, filled with Oliver's stories and observations, including detailed notes about his father's business calls that he'd overheard, with suggestions for solving problems that had been bothering Mr. Whitmore for months. And the billionaire laughed through his tears as he realized his 7-year-old son had figured out a supply chain issue that his entire team of executives hadn't been able to solve. And Oliver suddenly stood up and walked to his father's desk, pulling out a hidden drawer that Mr. Whitmore didn't even know existed, revealing hundreds of papers covered in writing, all the thoughts and feelings and dreams Oliver had been documenting for years, waiting for someone to discover them. And as Mr. Whitmore read through them, he found letters Oliver had written to him but never delivered. Letters that said things like, "Dear Daddy, today you looked sad in your meeting and I wanted to hug you but my body won't let me." And "Dear Daddy, I heard you tell someone I'm your biggest failure but you're wrong because I'm your biggest success. You just can't see it yet." And "Dear Daddy, Martha makes me feel real." And with each letter, Mr. Whitmore's understanding of his son transformed completely, seeing not a child trapped in silence but a brilliant mind that had been screaming to be heard in the only way it could, through written words that nobody had bothered to look for. And he turned to Martha with an expression of such gratitude and pain that she had to look away. And he asked her to tell him everything about his son, the real Oliver, not the one in medical files and diagnostic reports. And Martha's voice grew warm as she described Oliver's humor, how he'd leave funny notes about the cook's terrible singing or draw pictures of the gardener's ridiculous hat. And she told him about Oliver's empathy, how he'd written her a poem when she'd come to work looking sad one day, how he'd arranged flowers from the garden to spell "feel better" on her cleaning cart. And she explained his fears too, how he was terrified of the specialists with their cold hands and loud voices, how he'd written, "They don't see me, just my broken parts," after one particularly harsh evaluation. And Mr. Whitmore felt his heart shattering and rebuilding with each revelation, understanding finally that his son hadn't needed fixing but simply needed someone to meet him where he was, in his world of written words and silent communication. and Oliver began writing on his magnetic board again, spelling out, "I want to stay home with you, Daddy." And Mr. Whitmore dropped to his knees, pulling Oliver into his arms for the first time in years, feeling his son's thin body stiffen and then slowly, miraculous relax into the embrace. And he whispered, "You're staying home forever, Oliver, and Ms. Jenkins is staying too, if she'll have us." And Martha nodded through her tears as Oliver pulled back and wrote, "She taught me to hope." And then something extraordinary happened as Oliver opened his mouth, and though the sound was barely a whisper, rough and unpracticed, they all heard it clearly as he said Dad-dy. 2 syllables that seemed to echo through the mansion like thunder. And Mr. Whitmore sobbed harder, holding his son tighter. And Oliver wrote one more thing that would change everything. "I have so much to tell you." And from that moment, the revelation was complete, not just of Oliver's abilities, but of a father's blindness, a child's resilience, and a maid's courage to break the rules for love. And as they sat there in the library, surrounded by thousands of books and Oliver's scattered notes, Mr. Whitmore made a decision that would transform all their lives, asking Martha to help him learn to communicate with his son, to enter Oliver's world instead of trying to force Oliver into his. And Oliver's face lit up with a joy so pure that Martha knew every risk she'd taken had been worth it. And as the evening sun cast golden light through the library windows, the same windows where Oliver had once written lonely, he now wrote family. And for the first time in 7 years, the Whitmore mansion felt like a home instead of a beautiful prison. All because one woman had dared to see a child who desperately needed to be seen. 6 months had passed since that life-changing evening in the library, and the Whitmore mansion had transformed into something unrecognizable from its former cold perfection, with colorful communication boards in every room, tablets with speech apps on every surface, and most importantly, laughter echoing through halls that had once known only silence. And Martha no longer pushed a cleaning cart through these rooms, but instead carried teaching materials and books. Her official title, now educational companion and family advisor, with a salary that made her daughter cry with relief when she heard about it. And Oliver had bloomed like a flower reaching toward the sun, his confidence growing daily as he discovered new ways to express the thoughts that had been trapped inside him for so long. And though he still struggled with spoken words, managing only a few phrases that required enormous effort, his written communication had become so sophisticated that Mr. Whitmore often asked his opinion on business matters. And just last week, Oliver had written a solution to a merger problem that saved the company $12 million, causing the board of directors to jokingly suggest hiring him as their youngest consultant. And the library had been completely transformed into Oliver's learning center, with specialized computers, walls covered in his artwork and writing, and a corner Martha called Oliver's publishing house, where they bound his stories into real books with covers he designed himself. And today was special because Oliver had been working on something secret for weeks, refusing to show even Martha what he was creating, only telling them it was the most important thing I'll ever write. And his family and friends gathered in the library for what Mr. Whitmore had described as Oliver's presentation. Martha felt nervous butterflies in her stomach, watching Oliver stand at the front of the room with his communication device, and a large screen behind him, and Mr. Whitmore sat in the front row, his face showing the same mixture of pride and anxiety that had become familiar over these transformative months. And Oliver began his presentation by typing into his device, which spoke in the clear digital voice he'd chosen. "My name is Oliver Whitmore. I am 8 years old, and I want to tell you my story." And the screen behind him lit up with the title Finding My Voice, a journey from silence to song. And what followed was the most beautiful and heartbreaking presentation anyone had ever witnessed, as Oliver had created a multimedia story of his life, starting with photos of himself as a baby, with captions he'd written like they said, "I was different from the beginning, and my parents didn't know that different meant special." And he showed videos of himself before Martha, sitting alone at the window, with text explaining. I could hear everything, but my words were locked in a box I couldn't open. And then came the part about Martha, with secret photos Oliver had somehow taken of their lessons, and his device spoke the words he'd written. Martha Jenkins saw me when I was invisible. She heard me when I was silent. She taught me that love is the best teacher. And Martha had to grip her chair to keep from sobbing as Oliver continued, showing examples of his first words, his first stories, his first jokes that had made Martha laugh during their secret sessions. And then came the revelation scene, with Oliver's honest description of his fear and hope when his father discovered their secret, and his device read, "I thought I would lose Martha, but instead I found my daddy," and Mr. Whitmore was openly crying now, as Oliver showed the progression of the past 6 months, including videos of their first father-son reading session where Mr. Whitmore had stumbled over children's books, while Oliver patiently corrected him with his letterboard, photos of them building a robot together with Oliver directing through written instructions, and a beautiful moment caught on security camera where Mr. Whitmore had kissed Oliver's forehead and Oliver had managed to whisper, "Love you" in return. And the presentation showed Oliver's academic achievements, how he was now studying at a high school level in most subjects, how he'd started learning 3 languages simultaneously, because patterns made sense to him in ways that amazed university professors who'd come to study his methods. And then Oliver revealed his biggest surprise, a book he'd written and illustrated called The Boy Who Spoke in Colors, which would be published next month, with all proceeds going to autism education programs, and he'd dedicated it to Martha Jenkins, who taught me to read, to write, and to believe, and to my daddy, who learned that listening doesn't always require ears. And as the presentation neared its end, Oliver did something unprecedented, walking to the microphone and, with enormous effort, speaking without his device, his voice cracking and uncertain, but filled with determination, as he said, "Thank, you, Martha, for, saving me," and then turning to his father, "Dad, you, are, my, hero. Now," and the room erupted in applause as Oliver smiled. Really smiled. Not the practiced expression therapists had tried to teach him, but a genuine burst of joy that transformed his entire face. And Martha stood up, walking to Oliver and hugging him tightly, whispering, "You saved yourself, my brave boy. I just showed you the door." And Mr. Whitmore joined them, creating a group hug that would have seemed impossible just 6 months ago. And as the guests wiped their tears and celebrated, Oliver typed one final message on his device that appeared on the screen. "Every child has a voice. Sometimes we just need to learn how to listen differently." And in that moment, everyone understood that this wasn't just Oliver's story, but a lesson for the world about presuming incompetence, about the danger of seeing disability instead of possibility, about the power of one person believing in another. And as the afternoon sun streamed through the library windows, the same windows where Oliver had once written lonely in fog, he now stood surrounded by people who understood him, valued him, and most importantly, heard him in whatever way he chose to communicate. And Martha watched with pride as Oliver showed his father his next project, a website where nonverbal children could share their stories and connect with each other, proving that from a small act of kindness, of one woman choosing to see a child rather than a diagnosis, an entire world could change. And as Oliver's fingers flew across his keyboard, writing messages to other children like him around the world, telling them they weren't broken, they weren't alone, and they had so much to say, if only someone would stop and listen. Martha knew that this was just the beginning of Oliver's journey, and what a magnificent journey it would be.